I first came in 1988, and I was professor at that time, young professor. And the reason I came here was not so much that I heard about Aspen Center for Physics at that time, but I came here because of a spectacularly interesting workshop on high temperature superconductors, which came on scene just a year before I came to Aspen, and it was organized by two organizers from the center, Ravin Bhatt and Steve Kivelson. Well, Ravin was at the center and Steve was not at the center. And I came here and I was so impressed with the workshop and the surrounding. That was the first time I came to Aspen, and I've always had interest in music, and so that was the selling point. And music was so great that particular year, and the physics was so great. And in fact, I remember this occasion very well because there were very important things that were discussed in that workshop, and that impressed me very much, and that furthered my career quite a bit. Depending on these discussions that we had new ideas, new ways of looking at things on high temperature superconductors, and that was so important that I started coming back over and over again. And within a couple of years, I was made general member. At that time, when I first came here, I became general member. That was the first year there was trustees and general members as separate group of people. That was the first year I was here. And so within a year or so after I became general member, I became scientific secretary of Aspen Center for Physics. And this is not a very trivial job. At least at that time it was even more non-trivial because the computers were very primitive, and we had a Macintosh program which crashed almost all the time, and we have to keep a backup of database of, I don't remember, at that particular occasion, the year that I was secretary, there were like 700 about 700 applications, and keeping track of this database was not terribly easy. Now, the scientific secretary, the name is actually kind of strange, because I used to get letters first saying that people would think that scientific secretary is just a clerk, an administrative personnel, and didn't probably realize that I was a professor at some institution. Now, but if you go past that, scientific secretary, the job of scientific secretary is extremely important because you have to organize the admissions committee. And that was one of the most important jobs, and that is still the most important jobs, to admit. And you have to make sure that that balance of different disciplines work out correctly, that we have substantial number of new members coming in. And this is very important, and scientific secretary at that time had quite a bit of influence on the admission process, especially in terms of getting new participants. I don't know what the statistics was, and it has always been that we have had many new participants come in every year. And we had to coordinate after admissions committee, we had to coordinate everything with the administrative personnel at the center, which was Sally Mensimer at that time. And we even had to decide on late applications and decide on complicated application process and coordinate some of the admissions even very late with Sally Mensimer, who was the was the administrative vice president at that time. One of the difficult things about being a scientific secretary and combined with that admission process was that there were only, at that time, there were only about 84 slots at any point of time. And the number of applications, as I was saying before, would run into something like 700, and probably we could not admit more than 430 or 440 applicants. And they would have, at that time, average length of stay was about 3 weeks. This was in 1988. And this was a very difficult juggling process because you had to balance a lot of things. You had to balance older participants against senior participants against junior participants. You had to balance against people coming from institutions which are not well known, but they have done excellent work. So sometimes we even had to look up the papers they wrote before, in fact, the admission process. I'm not sure how much of that is done these days, but we actually did look up the papers. And scientific secretary had quite a bit of control on how the admission process ran in its details. For example, how many participants we would have in the first part of the summer, and then the last part of the summer, and the middle of the summer, which is the prime time. How would we balance against general members versus new participants, because that's the time when, in July, when everybody wanted to come. So we had to juggle a lot at that time. And it was not particularly, it's not an easy job, but it always worked out at the end to be in a reasonably satisfactory manner. But we did pay a lot of attention to, when people apply, they have to state 3 recent papers that they have written. Sometimes we would know the people who, quite often we would know the people who applied, but there are quite often the new participants we didn't know, and those 3 papers that they mentioned in their application, we did look them up and discuss them. And the admission process went for 2 or 3 days, 2.5 days.
Where did you have the admissions process?
In my case, it was at UCLA, at my home institution. I think that traditionally has been the case, that the secretary's home institution was the place. One thing that is very nice these days is that at the admission meeting, the program committee members, at least one of them, or the chair of the program committee, is present at the admissions committee. This started very recently. When I was doing this job, it wasn't there, but I think it's an extremely useful improvement on the process, because the program committee chair can then sort of understand the balance between the different programs and so on. So that was mostly the job, but then it's also true that many people those days would actually send you emails even outside that short period of time when admissions committee met. In particular, starting November, you would start getting emails about various questions about the center, various questions about the participants, there are various questions about workshops, various pressures you'd get from various people, and even some of the eminent people now who are members and trustees here at this point of time in Aspen Center for Physics. So we had to, answer those questions. And that was all basically in the hands of the scientific secretary. We did not send it back to the president or to the chair of the board or to Sally Mensimer, or if the scientific secretary had to answer some of these questions. For example, a participant who is very eminent, he would say that, well, I would like to be here, and you couldn't possibly say, no, well, you have to just apply and then we'll see whether you can be here or not. You just have to be much more politically deft in. So it was a very complex process, and it was long. It's 3 or 4 months long. The housing units, housing was not something that we dealt with as a secretary. But what was a nightmare was the paper applications. And the paper applications would come randomly either at the secretary's institution or come to Aspen Center for Physics, to Sally Mensimer, who was the administrative vice president. And then she had to send those back, and there was a lot of problems involving these paper applications. And it was very complicated. You had to be very organized, have very good tracks of, because the database was not very well developed. When I did my term as scientific secretary, Mike Cross was then member of Aspen Center for Physics, had just developed a software program, database program, which was the primitive version of FileMaker Pro, which would run reasonably well. But we had to input all that data from the paper application into the software without basically any help, and that's where your secretarial role came in. You really had to type it in, those applications. Luckily, my wife helped tremendously when I was doing this job, because I still can't type really well. I type with one finger, and she did quite a bit of work, and that worked out. But I think that was a non-trivial operation to put into the FileMaker Pro. There were no constraints how many one-bedroom people had to be admitted, or two-bedroom people had to be admitted, and three-bedroom. I think Sally basically took care of all of that in my time. And all we had to give her is a rather balanced distribution, because she could not handle more than 84 slots. The desks were much more important, much more difficult to handle. Sometimes people would triple up in a particular room. That was more difficult than actually housing, if I remember it right. Housing was not such a terribly difficult problem. Sally always managed that. But what was difficult for her was if we went to 96 as opposed to 84, which happened, then it was getting desks was the real hard problem. And it was nice, actually, because some of the permanent members, general members, would actually be very kind and gracious and give up their desk for a certain period of time to accommodate some younger participants. And that worked out really well. Members are part of the board, in a sense, for the Aspen Center for Physics. So they have certain privileges and they have certain responsibilities. Participants are the people who come here for the workshop, and they participate in the programs and they do their work, but they don't have to take any particular responsibility in running the center. So that's what members, the difference is. Talking about the role of being a member, I think that's an important point. The way I became member at that time was, the whole thing seemed like very simple and trivial. Patrick Lee came to me and said, I see that you like to come here and you like the music festival, would you like to be member for Aspen Center for Physics? I was delighted, and I didn't think much of it. I didn't think about what responsibility I would have to have. Patrick said, well, you don't have to do that much. You have to be secretary once in your during the time that you are a member, and you just have to put some input into organization of the center and organization of the workshops. Mostly scientific advising is all you need, and basically that didn't seem much. And I was delighted, actually. And it was a very simple process. I mean, he asked me, and the following day there was a meeting, and he came out of the meeting and said, "Well, now you're a member. You can come and join the meeting." And but then as time went by, I have been member for 3 terms altogether, like 15 years in a row. When I was a member, I began to realize that the responsibilities was much more than what Patrick had suggested. There are various important committees, and one of the important committee is the nomination committee, where you nominate new members, and you put together a slate, and that's always very important because you would like to get really good young participants and members in the system, and then not only that, I ran at least 2 workshops, maybe more, 3 probably, and then I did winter conferences number of times. Sid Meshkov had delegated the responsibility to me to run the condensed matter winter workshops, and I think I probably organized 4 to 5 winter conferences. That was not very hard because those days you had to raise external funding for the winter conference because within the Aspen budget, NSF budget, we didn't have winter conference folded in. So if you organize the condensed matter winter conference, you had to go out to NSF directly, to various other agencies, and raise funding for that conference. And one particular year we were very successful, and we raised about $25,000 for that particular winter conference. And some other times we were not that successful. And that was not easy because you had to sort of attract people even though you are not paying for them for the conference. And that's not the style in which other conferences run. But luckily, Aspen had some attraction, both scientifically and otherwise, that people tended to come to these conferences. So I think that being a member of this center is actually, if you take it seriously, it's quite a bit of work. And at the same time, you are being a faculty member of 2 different institutions, which means you have to be in faculty meetings in 2 different places and so on. Right. I mean, you have to be at these board meetings, and you have to be in faculty meetings in your own institutions, and they're quite a lot of work. So it's not such a simple job to be a general member. It's not just an honorific job, but it requires a substantial amount of work.